Before Middle-earth, before time itself, there was only the one. Aru Ilúvatar, from his thoughts came the Ainur, the Holy Ones, immortal spirits of immense power and purpose. They were the first minds shaped by Ilúvatar, each reflecting a part of his eternal design. To them, Ilúvatar revealed a wondrous and mysterious gift, music, and it was through music, not fire or storm, that the world would be born. This music was no simple melody. It was a symphony of creation, layered and vast beyond imagination. Each Ainur contributed their unique voice to the harmony, their melodies weaving together in magnificent patterns. Yet they were not mere instruments. They possessed free will and creativity. Among them were powerful beings like Manwe, the lord of air and wind, Olmo, master of waters, and Ole, the smith and shaper of matter. But there was one who stood above all others in might, Melkor. Melkor was the greatest of the Ainur, and in his heart burned a hunger for power and mastery. Even during the great music, his thoughts began to drift from Ilúvatar's theme. He sought to weave his own visions into the harmony, introducing discordant notes. Where the music had once flowed like a single river, it now clashed in tension and dissonance. Some Ainur faltered in confusion. Others followed Melkor's defiant tune, seduced by his boldness. But Ilúvatar, watching all with infinite wisdom, responded. Rather than destroy Melkor's discord, Ilúvatar wove it into the greater theme, transforming conflict into depth. Three great themes arose during the music of the Ainur. The first was noble and mighty, the order of creation. The second was richer still, embracing the beauty of sorrow and joy. And the third, which Ilúvatar himself introduced, was unlike anything before, a theme of hope that rose above all strife. In the end, Melkor's rebellion was not silenced, but it was made to serve a purpose greater than he understood. When the music ended, Ilúvatar showed the Ainur what they had created together, a vision of the world. There they saw the mountains, oceans, stars, beasts, and peoples that would someday live and love, suffer and triumph. Many Ainur were moved to tears. Then Ilúvatar spoke a single word, and the vision became reality. The universe, known as Ea, the world that is, came into being. But the Ainur could not merely watch from afar. Those who chose to enter Ea became bound to its time and fate. Among them were the greatest of the Ainur, those who would become known as the Valar and the Maiar. They descended into Arda, the earth, which at first was young and formless. There they labored to shape it into a place where the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men, could someday awaken. The Valar worked in harmony at first. Olaf forged the bones of the earth, raising mountains and shaping the land. Olom poured out the seas, filling valleys with water and sending rain from the skies. Yavanna brought forth the first green things, trees, grasses and seeds. Varda, called Elberith by the elves, kindled the stars in the heavens, filling the dark with beauty and light. Yet even in the shaping of the world, Melkor was not idle. He too entered Arda, driven by jealousy and lust for power. Wherever the Valar created, Melkor came behind to undo or corrupt. He raised up mountains only to cast them down again. He froze lands meant to be fertile or scorched them with flame. His interference caused chaos in the delicate balance of creation, and war broke out among the Valar. For a time the world was marred, beautiful, but wounded from its very beginning. Still, the Valar persisted. They built the two lamps, Illuin in the north, and Ormel in the south, to light the world. Under their glow, life began to flourish, and the first great kingdoms were raised. But Melkor, striking from his fortress of Atuno, destroyed the lamps, plunging the world into darkness and fire. The Valar were forced to retreat to the far west of Arda, building a new home in Aman, the Undying Lands. There in the realm of Valinor, they created the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin, silver and gold, which once again brought light to the world, but only in the west. Middle-earth was left in twilight, a land of growing shadows. Though the Valar shaped the world with care and foresight, they could not yet heal it completely. Melkor's corruption ran deep, twisting the lands and breeding creatures of darkness. Yet despite his constant interference, the groundwork had been laid for all the ages to come. The first age did not truly begin with the music. nor with the shaping of the mountains and seas. It began in potential, in divine conflict and divine harmony. The music of the Ainur revealed that even discord had a place in the grand design, and that free will, even when misused, could not destroy the beauty of Ilúvatar's vision. The elves and men had not yet awakened. The stars shone over a quiet world, full of mystery and peril. But already, the great conflict between light and shadow had begun, a conflict that would define the First Age, and echo across all the ages that followed. The Ainur had sung the world into being, and now their song would live on in every river, stone and living soul. The stage was set, and history was about to begin. Long before the world was formed, long before stars shone or seas stirred, Melkor was the mightiest of all the Ainur. His power was rivaled by none, and his knowledge was vast, for he had wandered alone through the void, seeking the flame imperishable, the secret fire of true creation that belonged to Ilúvatar alone. It was this yearning for dominion over creation, for power that was not his to wield, that sowed the seeds of rebellion in Melkor's heart. From the very beginning, Melkor's desires set him apart. While others delighted in the harmony of the music, Melkor sought to impose his own themes upon it. He did not wish to contribute, he wished to control. He dreamed of forging his own worlds, of bending existence to his will, and of standing as a creator in his own right. But the flame imperishable resided only with Ilúvatar, beyond the grasp of even the greatest Ainur. This denial embittered Melkor, and from that bitterness was born pride, resentment, and ultimately, malice. When Ilúvatar revealed the vision of the world, Arda Melkor saw in it an opportunity to fulfill his ambitions. And when the world was made real through the power of the One, Melkor descended into it with many other Ainur. But unlike the Valar who came to serve and shape the world in harmony, Melkor came to dominate. He wanted to rule Arda, not steward it. In his mind, it was his birthright. In the early shaping of Arda, Melkor contested every act of creation. Where the Valar raised mountains, he leveled them. Where Ulmo filled the seas, Melkor stirred them with storms. He introduced extremes of cold and heat, forming regions of ice and fire that were not part of the original harmony. Though Arda had been created as a reflection of Ilúvatar's perfect vision, Melkor marred it from the very start. Thus Arda became the marred world, a place of both beauty and pain. Melkor's power in those early days was immense. He gathered to himself many lesser spirits, Ainur who were drawn to his strength or corrupted by his promises. Among them were powerful beings who would become his chief servants. Most notably Sauron, a Maya of great cunning, who would one day become a dark lord in his own right. As Melkor's malice grew, so too did his need for a stronghold from which to operate. He established his first fortress in the far north of Arda, Utumno. There, deep beneath the earth, he built vast halls and dark pits, where his corrupted followers gathered. It was in Utumno that Melkor began his dark experiments, twisting the natural order, corrupting living things and preparing his armies of evil. The Valar, aware of Melkor's rising threat, convened in the blessed realm of led by Manwë, the High King of the Valar, and brother to Melkor in the thought of Ilúvatar. They debated how best to respond. Manwë, filled with compassion and wisdom, still held hope that Melkor might return to the light. But Tolkos, the strongest of the Valar, demanded action. Ultimately, the Valar resolved to confront Melkor and cleanse Arda of his corruption. Thus began the first great war in Arda, the Battle of the Powers. Tolkos descended into Middle-earth, and the forces of the Valar assaulted Utumno. The war raged for ages. Mountains were shattered, seas rose and fell, and the very shape of the world was altered. But in the end, the Valar triumphed. Utumno was broken, and Melkor was captured and brought in chains to Valinor. In Valinor, Melkor was judged by the Valar, and sentenced to imprisonment within the halls of Mandos, for 3 ages. It was a time of peace, and many believed that the darkness had been banished forever. But evil cannot be undone so easily, though bound and silenced. Melkor's hatred only deepened. He brooded over his defeat and plotted revenge, all while wearing a mask of humility before the Valar. When his sentence was completed, Melkor was released. He pleaded for forgiveness and was allowed to dwell in Valinor, under watch. But this was a mistake, for while the Valar believed in redemption, Melkor had no intention of changing. He walked the golden halls of the Blessed Realm, sowing seeds of doubt and division, especially among the Noldor, the most curious and ambitious of the Elves. Chief among those affected by Melkor's whispers was Fëanor, the greatest of the Noldor, whose pride and brilliance would soon be turned toward ruin. Melkor fanned the flames of jealousy, distrust, and rebellion, and all the while, he sought to reclaim the power he had lost. Eventually, Melkor fled Valinor, striking one final blow before his escape. With the help of the monstrous spider creature Ungoliant, he destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor, the source of all light in the world, and stole the Silmarils, the radiant jewels crafted by Fëanor. With the Silmarils in his possession, Melkor fled to the far north, and rebuilt his fortress in Angband, deeper and darker than Utuno had ever been. From this moment on, he would no longer be called Melkor by the Elves. He would be known by a name of dread, Morgoth, the black foe of the world. He had become not just a rebel but the embodiment of evil in Arda. His war against the Valar, against the Elves, and against all that was good, had only just begun. Thus the awakening of Melkor was not merely his descent into evil, it was the fall of light into shadow, of greatness into ruin. And from this fall the long tragedy of the First Age would be born. In the earliest days of Arda, the world was cloaked in twilight. The Ainur who had entered the world, the Villa and the Maiar, found it dark and incomplete, a raw canvas yearning to be shaped. So they began their labors, each according to their gifts. Ole, the master smith, crafted the bones of the earth, raising mountains and valleys. Olum poured the seas into the low places, and shaped the rivers. Yavanna, the giver of fruits, caused plants to sprout, and beasts to stir. Together they sculpted the world into a place of great beauty and potential. But the world still lacked one essential element, light, and without it, the works of the Valar could not flourish. To remedy this, Ole forged 2 mighty pillars, reaching high into the heaven. Upon these, the Valar placed 2 radiant lamps, Ilúin in the north and Ormel in the south. These were no ordinary lights, they shone with pure, unfiltered brilliance, illuminating the world in an even glow that had no shadow. The Valar rejoiced, for under the lamps, Arda bloomed. Mountains glittered, seas sparkled, and forests awoke in color and life. They built their first home in the central continent of Arda, a land called Almaren, where the light of both lamps mingled perfectly. There they dwelt in harmony, shaping the world with purpose. This time of peace and beauty would later be known as the Spring of Arda, the world's first and brief golden age. Yet even in this time of wonder, darkness stirred. Melkor, whose name would later become Morgoth, had already begun his campaign of disruption and defiance. Though defeated in the First War and absent from the shaping of the lamps, he was not idle. In secret places beneath the earth, in the farthest north of Arda, he built his stronghold, Utuno, a dark and frozen fortress of dread. There he gathered the spirits that had followed him, corrupted beasts, and twisted the forms of creation into monstrosities. He looked upon the light of the 2 lamps with hatred, for it was a symbol of the Valar's power and beauty, a world shaped without him, without his dominance. And so he plotted their destruction. He studied their cycles and structure, and when the time was right, he struck with overwhelming fury. The assault was catastrophic. The pillars of the lamps were toppled, and their destruction caused earthquakes, floods, and chaos that shattered Almaren and altered the shape of the world. Mountains were heaved up, seas surged where plains had been, and the perfect symmetry of Arda was lost. The Valar were devastated, their home was ruined, and the Spring of Arda was ended. Melkor retreated into Utuno, where he fortified his defenses and grew bolder in his wickedness. He now ruled much of the world in shadow, while the Valar, mourning their loss, withdrew from Middle-earth. They journeyed to the far west of the world, and established a new home, Aman, the Blessed Realm. There, in a land they named Valinor, they built a sanctuary of light and peace, far from Melkor's reach. Yet they needed light once more. And so Yavanna, in sorrow and hope, conceived a new and even greater gift, the two trees of Valinor. Upon the green hill of Ezelohar, with the aid of Nienna's tears and her own song, Yavanna brought forth two living trees unlike any seen before. The first, Telperion, bore silver light, and the second, Laurelin, bore golden. Their light was softer and more enchanting than that of the lamps, waxing and waning in overlapping cycles, that bathed Valinor in an ever-changing glow of silver and gold. The trees became the heart of the blessed realm, a symbol of divine beauty and the cycle of life. From them the Valar drew light for the stars and for many things to come. Under the trees, peace flourished again. The Valar built their city of Vaelmar, with white towers and golden domes. The Maiar walked freely, and music filled the air. But beyond the mountains that guarded Aman, Melkor's darkness continued to fester. With the Valar withdrawn to Aman, Melkor strengthened his hold on Middle-earth. He delved deeper into dark arts, creating horrific creatures, the first Balrogs, spirits of fire cloaked in shadow, terrible beasts that would one day haunt the nightmares of elves and men. He may have even begun his first attempts at twisting lesser beings into the earliest orcs, though this tale would not fully emerge until later. It was during this time in the growing dark of Middle-earth that the stars were first kindled by Varda, Queen of the Stars. She gathered the light of the trees and set brilliant constellations into the heavens, among them Melamakar the swordsman, a sign of coming war, and Velisirka, the sickle of the Valar, a symbol of defiance against Melkor. These stars shone over the slumbering lands where no sun had yet risen, and they would be the first light seen by the elves when they awoke. Even in the shadow of Melkor's growing power, the Valar did not forget the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men, whose coming had been foretold in the music of the Ainur. Though they knew not the hour of their arrival, they labored to make the world ready. Yet Melkor too awaited them, not with welcome, but with schemes. He would seek to corrupt them before the Valar could reach them. Thus the first wars of Arda, the destruction of the lamps, the fall of Almaren, and the founding of Utuno, set the stage for the drama of the First Age. The world had changed irrevocably. The balance between light and dark was broken, and a long struggle lay ahead. In the ruins of the lamps, forests now grew wild and untamed. The mountains were scarred by ancient violence, and the seas swelled with memories of shattered continents. Yet the two trees still shone in Valinor, casting light into a distant land untouched by evil. It was a light that would give birth to legends, to Silmarils, to kingdoms, and to tragedies yet to come. The war between creation and corruption had begun, and the world would never be the same again. In the twilight of the world, long before the coming of the sun or moon, before the lands were carved by the hands of kings or marred by the wars of Morgoth, there was silence beneath the stars, and into this silence, under the light of the constellations shaped by Varda, the firstborn children of Ilúvatar awoke. Far to east of Middle-earth, at a quiet lake called Quavianan, the elves opened their eyes for the first time. They saw the starlit sky reflected in still waters, the rustling of wind in untouched forests, and the gentle glow of silver constellations overhead. There was no guide, no teacher, only wonder. They were not shaped by Valar or Maiar, nor brought forth by the hands of the world. They came directly from Ilúvatar, perfect and complete in body, mind, and spirit. They call themselves the Quendi, those who speak, for among all the creatures of the world, they were the first to master speech. They sang and named the stars, the waters, the trees, giving shape and sound to the world around them. And though they were alone in the wide and wild lands of Middle-earth, they were not afraid, for the stars were beautiful, and beauty was in their. Yet the peace of their early years was fragile, for Melkor, hidden in the shadows of the north, had long known that the children of Ilúvatar would awaken. He watched from afar, and in his pride and hatred, he desired to either dominate them or destroy them. He saw in them a threat, a free people, not under his control. And so, in the darkness before the Valar discovered them, he moved swiftly to corrupt them. It is said that strange shapes began to wander the woods near Quavianan, dark creatures, shadows that slithered through the trees, watching the elves from afar. Some of the firstborn vanished, one by one. The legends tell of the hunter, a shadowy servant of Melkor, who would capture wandering elves and take them to Utuno. There, in pits of darkness and fire, Melkor began terrible experiments, twisting the bodies and spirits of these captives, breaking their wills, and forging mockeries of life. From this act of cruelty, the first orcs were said to be made, a perverse reflection of the elves, bred for hatred and war. Whether the elves of Quavianan understood the depth of this threat at first is unclear. But their joy began to be touched by fear. Strange noises echoed in the distance. Stars vanished behind black clouds. And though they did not yet know his name, they began to dread the dark places of the world, sensing that something ancient and evil was watching them. Meanwhile, in the west, the Valar became aware of the elves' awakening. It was Varda, queen of the stars, who first heard their voices and rejoiced. In answer, she kindled new stars in the sky, the most brilliant yet seen. She formed Vilas Circa, the sickle of the Valar, and placed it high in the north, as a sign of warning to Melkor, and a beacon of hope to the elves. The Valar were moved. For ages they had labored to prepare the world for the children of Ilúvatar, and now they were here alone, beautiful, and in danger. The time had come to act. They gathered in Valinor, and resolved to confront Melkor once again, to protect the firstborn from his poison, before it was too late. Thus began the war for the sake of the elves. The Valar marched eastward, led by Tulkas, the champion of strength and wrath. The war was vast and terrible. Mountains were torn asunder, rivers rerouted, and the lands of the north were cracked by fire and ice. At last, they reached Utuno, the black fortress of Melkor, and laid siege to it. The Valar broke the gates, stormed the halls, and captured Melkor. His servants were scattered, and Utuno was destroyed. Melkor was brought back in chains to Valinor. For a time peace returned, but the scars of his evil remained, especially in the corrupted creatures he had already scattered throughout Middle-earth, orcs, trolls, and other dark beasts born of his malice. These creatures would haunt the elves for ages to come. With Melkor imprisoned, the Valar turned their full attention to the elves. But their next decision would change the course of history forever. Should the elves remain in Middle-earth, free and independent, or should they be brought to Valinor, to dwell under the light of the two trees in safety and splendor? It was Orome, the great huntsman of the Valar, who had first discovered the elves and loved them deeply. He returned to Quavianan and spoke with them. But the elves were divided. Some were filled with wonder, and desired to see the land of the gods. Others feared the Valar, mistaking them for powers like Melkor. They remembered the dark times and the tales of the hunter. Eventually, a great summons was made, an invitation for all elves to come west and live in Valinor. The journey was long and perilous, and not all accepted. Those who did were led by 3 elven lords, Inwe, Finwë, and Elwë. Their kindreds would become the Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri, the High Elves. They began the great journey, crossing rivers, forests, and mountain ranges toward the sea, where they would be taken to Aman. But not all completed the journey. Some turned back. Some refused to leave their homelands. Others were lost or delayed. Thus the elves became divided into those who saw the light of Valinor, and those who did not. This division would shape the fate of the First Age in profound ways. For those who dwelt in the Blessed Realm would learn wisdom and power far beyond their kin in Middle-earth. And yet they would also bring with them pride, ambition, and the seeds of tragedy. The elves had awoken into a world both wondrous and wounded. They had sung beneath the stars, named the rivers, and dreamed of eternity. But they had also known fear. They had glimpsed the shadow, and even in the light of the trees, that shadow would follow them. For Melkor's influence was not ended. It had merely begun. The world was changed. The stars glittered above a silent Middle-earth, and the dark fortress of Melkor lay in ruin after the Valar's wrath. For the first time since their awakening, the elves walked in a world not overshadowed by a looming evil. And in that brief calm, a momentous decision was made, one that would forever divide the firstborn. The Valar, having finally seen the beauty and vulnerability of the elves, wished to shelter them. Their answer was an invitation to bring the children of Ilúvatar out of the twilight lands of Middle-earth into the golden light of Aman. the blessed realm, where the two trees shone and Melkor could never touch them again. It was a gesture of love and protection, but also one of control. The world was dangerous and untamed, and the Valar sought to gather the elves into their own domain, not realizing that some among them were already bound to Middle-earth in spirit. To persuade the elves, the Valar sent Orome, the huntsman, who had first discovered them at Cuivian. His arrival was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The elves had long feared shadowy beings in the dark, and some mistook him for a servant of the enemy. But Orome's voice was kind, and his heart noble. To ease their doubt, the Valar asked the elves to send 3 ambassadors to Valinor, to see its light with their own eyes and return with counsel. 3 great leaders were chosen: Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. These were lords among the elves, wise and strong of spirit. They crossed Middle-earth with Orome, sailed across the sea, and set foot in Aman. There they beheld the unimaginable, the radiance of Telperion and Laurelin, the trees of light, and the peaceful beauty of Valinor. It changed them forever. When they returned to Cuiviénen, their words burned with wonder. They urged their people to go west, to leave behind the starlit wilds of Middle-earth, and journey toward paradise. And so, the great journey began. Yet from the very start, the elves were divided. Some heard the call and answered eagerly. Others hesitated. Some mistrusted the Valar entirely. Thus the sundering of the elves began, a split that would ripple through all the ages to come. The elves who accepted the summons were called the Eldar, people of the stars who set out toward Aman. Those who refused were later named the Avari. The Avari remained behind in the forests and hills of Middle-earth, preferring the lands they knew over the promises of distant gods. They became secretive, scattered, and would later fade from most of Elvish lore. The Eldar, guided by Orome, began the perilous march westward. The journey spanned vast distances, forests, rivers, mountains, and long years. Along the way they encountered wonders and dangers alike. Some fell in love with the lands they crossed, and chose to settle there instead of continuing. These decisions led to further division. The 3 hosts of the Eldar took their names from their leaders. The Vanyar, followers of Ingwe, were the first and most devoted. They traveled swiftly, crossed the sea early, and came to dwell in Valinor, under the light of the trees. They were noble, golden-haired, and few in number. They loved the Valar, and never returned to Middle-earth. The Noldor, led by Fëanor, were strong-willed, curious, and skilled in craft and lore. Though they also completed the journey to Valinor, they retained a deeper connection to Middle-earth. Their hearts yearned for knowledge, and among them rose mighty figures, such as Fëanor and Galadriel. The Teleri, under Elwë, were the most numerous and the slowest to travel. They loved the waters, forests, and music. Many among them lingered along the way, and their delays caused further splintering. Some of the Teleri, led by Lenwë, broke away in the misty valleys of the Anduin, and turned south. These were called the Nandor, lovers of green and water. They would later become the Lyquindi, or Green Elves in Osiri, and others of the Teleri, confused or disheartened by the loss of their leader Elwë, who had vanished after encountering Milian, Amaya, remained behind in Beleriand. These elves became the Sindar, the Grey Elves. Though they never saw the light of the trees, they grew wise and noble, ruling kingdoms such as Doriath, where Elwë, now called Thingol, became king beside Milian. Meanwhile, the remaining Teleri finally reached the western shores of Middle-earth, but the sea posed a final obstacle. The Valar sent the island of Tol Eressë as a ferry, pulled by Ulmo across the ocean. The Vanyar and Noldor had already made this crossing, but when the ship returned for the Teleri, many of them refused to leave without their lost king. These elves stayed in the coastal lands of Alqualande, becoming the Falmari, the sea-loving Teleri, who would later play a key role in the tales of the Silmarils. Thus the great journey ended, not in unity, but in separation. The elves had split into 3 great branches: the Calaquendi, elves of the light, those who saw the trees in Valinor; the Vanyar, the Noldor, and some Teleri; the Morroquendi, elves of the darkness, those who never saw that light; the Avari, the Sindar, and the Nand. These names were not judgments of worth, but they reflected a key truth. The light of Valinor changed those who saw it. The Calaquendi gained wisdom, power, and beauty beyond the reach of their kin. But they also carried pride, and with pride came tragedy. In Valinor, the elves built great cities, Tirion, Alqualande, Valmar, and learned from the Valar. They crafted jewels, studied the stars, and delved into song and memory. But far across the sea, in the quiet woods of Beleriand and the wilds of the east, their cousins lived closer to the land and further from the light. These elves would come to know a different fate, one shaped more by shadow than by splendor. The Sundering was not a single event, but a long unraveling. It began with a choice to go or stay, and from that choice sprang countless lives, stories, loves and losses. The elves who had once awoken together by the shores of Cuivianen would now walk many roads. Some would rise to glory, others would fade, but all were bound by the memory of stars, the echo of the music, and the long journey that had carried them into history. With the great journey behind them, and the elves now divided between those who remained in Middle-earth and those who entered Aman, the Blessed Realm became the heart of harmony and wonder. The Valar, the powers of the world, had established their domain far from the ravaged lands of Melkor's former strongholds, and there they began anew, building a sanctuary unmarred by the darkness of the past. This land was Valinor, nestled in the westernmost region of Aman, and it became the most sacred and radiant realm in all of Arda. At the center of Valinor stood the green mound of Izelohar, and upon it bloomed the two trees of light, Telperion the silver, and Laurelin the gold. These were not mere flora, but radiant wonders, their mingled light bathing the land in an eternal dawn and dusk. The trees pulsed in rhythmic harmony. Telperion would wax and wane first, then Laurelin, and for one brief hour each cycle, their light would blend, casting the land in an ethereal brilliance. It was under this light that the Valar built their city, Valar, and the elves who had journeyed west, the Calaquendi, or Elves of the Light, were welcomed into its splendor. The elves flourished in Valinor. The Valyar, closest to the Valar in spirit, lived in harmony with Manwë and Varda on the slopes of Mount Taniketil, the tallest mountain in the world. The Noldor, ambitious and curious, built the hill city of Tirion between the trees and the sea, and there they delved deep into craft and lore. The Telari, who came later, remained by the shore in Alqualande, the haven of the swans, crafting ships of pearl and singing to the sea. But while the elves built beauty and peace in Valinor, Middle-earth remained in twilight, vast and wild, and not yet healed from the corruption Melkor had sown. Though Atuno was destroyed and Melkor had been captured by the Valar in the war for the sake of the elves, his legacy still lingered. Many of his servants had fled into dark corners of the world, and the twisted creatures he had made, such as the first orcs, balrogs, and other corrupted spirits, still wandered the untamed land. Melkor, meanwhile, had been bound in unbreakable chains and brought to the halls of Mandos, where he sat in silence for 3 long ages. The Valar held council, uncertain of his fate. Manwë, the High King of Arda and Melkor's brother in the thought of Ilúvatar, believed in redemption. He held to the hope that even the greatest of the fallen could return to the light. Others, such as Tolkas, the warrior, and Ulmo, the lord of the seas, were wary. They had seen Melkor's destruction and doubted he could be reformed. At the end of his sentence, Melkor was brought before the Valar. He bowed, humbled and quiet, and pleaded for forgiveness. He renounced his past and declared his desire to serve the world he once tried to destroy. And though some of the Valar doubted his sincerity, Manwë granted him relief. Melkor was allowed to walk freely in Valinor, under watch, and with the trust that he had changed. But Melkor had not changed. He had merely learned patience. In truth, his hatred for the Valar had only deepened, and he now turned his cunning toward more subtle means. No longer bound by brute force, Melkor now wove lies, half-truths, and manipulations, setting the stage for the tragedies that would soon unravel paradise. The elves, particularly the Noldor, were his target. He saw in them a mirror of himself, proud, brilliant, hungry for knowledge and mastery, and none among them shone brighter than Fëanor, the eldest son of Finwë, High King of the Noldor. Fëanor was a figure of unmatched skill and ambition. He had inherited the fire of his people, and amplified it with a genius that even Ole, the Vala of craft, admired. He was the first to capture the mingled light of the two trees and forge it into three perfect jewels, the Silmarils. These gems radiated with a beauty that no craft before or since would match. They were sacred, powerful, and alive with the light of creation. Melkor coveted them. He whispered into the ears of the Noldor, stoking fears and ambition. He told them that the Valar had brought them to Valinor, not out of love, but to contain them, to chain their greatness. He suggested that the Silmarils would not be safe, that others envied Fëanor's power. He hinted that the world beyond the sea was theirs by right, if only they dared to claim it. His words poisoned many hearts. Fëanor, proud and fiercely protective of his creations, began to trust no one. Even his own half-brother Fingolfin, who had always sought peace, became a rival in his eyes. The Noldor grew restless. Tension grew. Division festered. Eventually, Fëanor's paranoia and pride reached a breaking point. He drew a sword on Fingolfin in public, and was banished from Túrin. Finwë, refusing to part from his son, left with him, and together they dwelled in Formenos, far from the light of the trees. There Fëanor locked away the Silmarils, refusing even the Valar access to them. Melkor's plan was nearing completion. In secret, he allied himself with Ungoliant, a monstrous, ancient spirit of insatiable hunger, who had taken the form of a vast spider. Promising her a feast of light, Melkor led her to Valinor. There, under cover of darkness, they attacked. With a venomous bite and a suffocating shadow, Ungoliant drained the life from the two trees, killing them. Melkor then struck down Finwë, stole the Silmarils, and fled. The Valar were struck with horror. The light of the world was extinguished. The trees were dead, and the Silmarils were gone, the last vessels of that sacred light. Melkor, who once sat in chains, was now free, crowned in flame and shadow, and cloaked in a name he would carry henceforth. Morgoth, the black foe of the world. He returned to Middle-earth, built a new and greater fortress, Angband, and planted the Silmarils in his iron crown. There, in the far north of Beleriand, he declared himself king of the world and summoned his armies. The peace of Valinor was shattered. The Golden Age had ended. The Valar mourned, the trees could not be restored, and darkness rose once more. Yet even as the light failed, the Elves burned with new resolve. The theft of the Silmarils, the death of Finwë, and the lies that divided their people had pushed Fëanor beyond reason. In the next chapter of the First Age, his fury would ignite a fire that would consume kingdoms, families, and the very fabric of elvenkind. In the twilight of Valinor, with the two trees fallen and their light extinguished, the world stood at a turning point. The death of the trees had not only plunged Aman into darkness, but marked the end of an age of harmony, and the beginning of an age of pride, grief, and blood. At the center of this unfolding tragedy stood one elf, Fëanor, the most gifted, the most prideful, and ultimately, the most doomed of all the children of Ilúvatar. Born to Finwë, High King of the Noldor, and Míriel Serinde, the broideress, Fëanor, originally named Finwë, was unique from the moment of his birth. His spirit was so intense, so fierce in fire and will, that it drained his mother's strength entirely. Míriel passed into a death-like sleep shortly after bearing him, choosing to depart the world rather than continue life. Her passing was the first death in the Undying Lands, a foreshadowing of the grief her son would one day spread. Fëanor grew under Finwë's love and favor, but his heart burned always with a restlessness unmatched among the Noldor. He became the greatest craftsman of his people, mastering the arts of gem-cutting, language, runes, and smithing. But above all, his crowning achievement would define the destiny of the First Age, the creation of the Silmarils. Using materials and lore that no one else understood, Fëanor captured the mingled light of Telperion and Lorelin, the two trees of Valinor, and forged three perfect jewels. Each one glowed with an inner flame, holding the essence of all that was pure and radiant in creation. The Silmarils were not merely beautiful, they were holy. Even the Valar revered them. But Fëanor, driven by pride and possessiveness, refused to let them go. He guarded the Silmarils with obsession. He would allow no other hands to touch them, not even the Valar themselves. His love for the jewels outshone his love for kin or truth, and in this, Morgoth saw an opportunity. Freed from imprisonment and walking once more in Valinor, under the pretense of repentance, Melkor, now truly Morgoth, worked in whispers and shadows. He fanned the flames of Fëanor's pride, suggesting that the Valar had brought the elves to Amain, only to keep them from ruling Middle-earth. He spoke of hidden truths, of the greatness the Noldor could achieve if they returned to the world beyond the sea. And most dangerously, he hinted that the Silmarils were in danger, that others coveted them, that even the Valar could not be trusted. Fëanor listened, his suspicion deepened. When his half-brother Fingolfin, a noble and loyal prince, offered peace, Fëanor rejected it, drawing a sword in the streets of Tirion. For this threat he was banished by the Valar, and his father Finwë joined him in exile in Formenos, where Fëanor stored the Silmarils in a vault, hidden and guarded. Then came the final betrayal. Morgoth, denied the Silmarils by Fëanor, allied himself with Ungoliant, an ancient spirit of hunger and shadow. Together they attacked the heart of Valinor. Ungoliant drained the trees of their light, and Morgoth murdered Finwë at Formenos, stealing the Silmarils from beneath Fëanor's guard. The jewels, now stained by blood and treachery, were carried across the sea to Middle-earth, where Morgoth placed them in his iron crown and declared himself king of the world. In the aftermath of this horror, the Valar mourned. The trees were dead, the light was lost. Only the Silmarils now held the pure radiance of creation, and they were in the hands of the enemy. Fëanor's grief was unimaginable. His father lay slain, the jewels he loved more than life stolen by the Dark Lord. But in his mourning, there was no humility, only fire. He stood before the Noldor and made a vow that would shape all that followed. Before the people of Tirion, Fëanor swore the Oath of Fëanor, one of the most fateful and terrible declarations in all of art. He and his 7 sons, Maedhros, Maglor, Celagorm, Caranthir, Curufin, Amrod and Amros, bound themselves to a vow that none should possess the Silmarils but them. If any Vala, elf, man, or even Maya dared to hold one of the jewels, they would pursue them with wrath and death. The language of the oath was absolute, it was binding and wild, and though it stirred the hearts of many Noldor, it would lead to war, bloodshed and betrayal that would haunt the elves forever. The doom of Mandos, a grim prophecy of ruin and loss, was spoken then, warning that their rebellion would end in sorrow. But Fëanor, blinded by rage, rallied the Noldor to his cause. He called them to defy the Valar, to leave Valinor, and to return to Middle-earth. He promised them freedom, glory and vengeance. Some came willingly, others out of loyalty to family, others with hesitation. Among those who followed were Fingolfin and his sons, even though Fëanor had wronged him, and Fëanor, the youngest brother, though he would later turn back. But to cross the sea, they needed ships, and the only fleet in Valinor belonged to the Teleri of Alqualandi, peaceful elves who had no interest in rebellion. When the Teleri refused to give their ships, Fëanor attacked. The first kinslaying followed, elves killing elves, staining the shores with blood for the first time. It was a moment that shattered the innocence of the Eldar forever. Despite this horror, Fëanor took the ships and sailed across the sea. But once across, in a final act of betrayal, he burned the ships at Losgар, stranding Fingolfin and his people on the far side of the sea. They were forced to cross the Hilkaric Sea, the grinding ice, a deadly frozen wasteland at the northern edge of the world. Many perished, but Fingolfin endured. Fëanor reached Middle-earth and launched an assault on Morgoth's forces. At the battle under the stars, the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Noldor triumphed. Fëanor's fury was terrible to behold, but he pressed too far, chasing Morgoth's armies, to the very gates of Angband. There he was ambushed by Balrogs, and though he fought valiantly, he was mortally wounded. As he lay dying, Fëanor's spirit burned so brightly that his body turned to ash. With his final breath, he looked toward Angband, and realized that the Silmarils would never be recovered by force. Even in death, his pride endured, but so too did the curse he left behind. The oath of Fëanor lived on through his sons. It would drive them to seize kingdoms, betray kin, slaughter innocents, and pursue the Silmarils to the very end of the world. The jewels, once vessels of light, had become symbols of doom. The seeds had been planted, war had begun, and the first age of Middle-earth, born in fire and shadow, would be shaped by this oath, this pride, and this relentless hunger for beauty lost and stolen. It began in silence. A silence deeper than night, heavier than grief. The light of the two trees had filled Valinor with eternal radiance for uncounted years. In their glow, the elves and Valar lived in harmony, crafting beauty and wisdom unmarred by time or death. But nothing in Arda was untouched by the shadow of Melkor. And when he struck, it was not with swords or armies, but with poison, lies, and darkness. Absolute, Melkor's exile had ended in deception. Pardoned by Manwë, he had returned to Valinor wearing a mask of repentance. Yet behind his feigned humility, Hachert burned. He envied the growing greatness of the elves, especially the Noldor, whose skill and ambition rivaled even the Ainur. And of all the Noldor, one stood apart. Fëanor, son of Finwë. Melkor saw in him a perfect instrument, proud, volatile, brilliant, and he began whispering lies into his heart. He sowed seeds of mistrust, that the Valar envied the Noldor's talents, that they feared their strength, that they kept them hidden in Valinor, to prevent them from ruling Middle-earth. And most cunningly, he hinted that others coveted the Silmarils, the radiant jewels Fëanor had crafted from the mingled light of the two trees, a feat no Vala could replicate. Fëanor believed the lies, his heart darkened, his pride sharpened into suspicion, and soon he stood estranged from his kin. When his half-brother Fingolfin tried to reconcile, Fëanor, inflamed by paranoia, threatened him with a blade. This was the first time bloodshed was even contemplated in Aman, and the Valar were alarmed. They summoned Fëanor before them and banished him from Túrin for his violence. He went to Fermennos, taking the Silmarils with him, locking them away, even from the eyes of the Valar. His father Finwë followed, unwilling to abandon his beloved son. Yet while Fëanor fumed in exile, Melkor's next move was already taking shape. With his lies now stirring division among the Noldor, he vanished from Valinor, but not alone. In the deepest shadow, he sought out Ungoliant, a being of vast and ancient hunger, older than even the Valar remembered. She was a spirit of emptiness, taking the form of a monstrous spider, and wherever she moved, she devoured light and excreted webs of pure darkness. Melkor promised her a feast beyond imagining, the light of the trees, if she aided him. And so they crept together, cloaked in shadow no light could pierce, into the very heart of Valinor. It was a festival night. The Valar and Elves had gathered in celebration, unaware of the darkness crawling toward them. Then, without warning, the world changed. Ungoliant descended upon the trees and drank their light, venom seeping into their roots, turning their golden and silver glow to ash. Melkor struck the final blow, cleaving into the trunks, and the trees withered and died. Darkness fell, true darkness, not the gentle twilight of stars, but an abyssal void. The Valar were stunned. The Elves trembled. Never before had evil struck so close to the heart of their paradise. While the Valar reeled, Melkor raced to Fermennos. There he slew Finwë, the first murder in the Undying Lands, and stole the Silmarils. Fëanor's treasures, his very soul made substance, were torn from his vaults by the hand of the enemy. Melkor fled with Ungoliant into the north, but even he had not anticipated her insatiable hunger. When she demanded the Silmarils as part of her reward, Melkor refused. Their light burned even her shadowed. In rage, Ungoliant attacked, binding him in webs, nearly devouring him, until his shriek summoned the Balarugs, sleeping deep beneath Angband. They drove her off, and Melkor escaped, returning to Middle-earth and fortifying his new stronghold in Angband. There he placed the Silmarils in his iron crown, and declared himself king of the world. Back in Valinor, grief turned to fire. When Fëanor learned of Finwë's death, and the theft of the Silmarils, his sorrow was boundless. But his response was not humility, nor prayer, it was fury. Standing before the Noldor in Túrin, he delivered a speech unlike any other in Elven history. He spoke of betrayal, not just by Melkor, but by the Valar. He claimed they had failed to protect their people, failed to stop the theft of his greatest work. He named Melkor anew, Morgoth, the black foe of the world, a name the Elves would never forget. And then before the assembled Noldor, Fëanor did what no elf had done before. He bound himself and his sons by an unbreakable oath, an oath that would stain all future history with tragedy. Be he friend or foe, Valar or demon, elf or man as yet unborn, who shall hold or take or keep a Silmaril from their possession, shall be an enemy of Fëanor and his house, and he shall be slain ere the end. It was a vow of absolute vengeance, of unrelenting pursuit, and it was sworn in defiance of the Valar, under the stars with fire in their eyes and doom in their hearts. The oath of Fëanor became a curse. It drove the Noldor to rebellion, to a terrible decision, to abandon Valinor and return to Middle-earth, not as refugees, but as conquerors. They would wrest the Silmarils from Morgoth, not for justice, but for pride. Not all Noldor were swayed. Fingolfin, the youngest son of Finwë, turned back and remained in Aman. But Fingolfin, noble and ever loyal, chose to follow Fëanor, not out of agreement, but to protect their people. And so the Noldor divided. The oath hung over them like a storm. As they departed, they faced one final atrocity. They needed ships to cross the sea, and the only fleet belonged to the Teleri at Alqualondë. When the Teleri refused to lend them, unwilling to aid rebellion, Fëanor ordered an attack. The first kinslaying followed, elf against elf, brother against brother. The sea ran red with innocent blood. It was the first time the elves had turned on their own. It would not be the last. And thus, the light of Valinor faded behind them. The trees were gone, the Silmarils were lost, and the Noldor, once the favored of the Valar, now marched east under a banner of vengeance, and a vow that could not be undone. From the ashes of paradise, they had forged their doom. The light of Valinor had been extinguished. The two trees lay dead, their radiant blossoms turned to withered husks. Morgoth had struck his blow, stealing the Silmarils and fleeing into the shadows of Middle-earth. Yet in the wake of this destruction, the true fire had only just been kindled, not in the halls of the Valar, but in the heart of Fëanor. Blinded by fury, pride, and grief, Fëanor was no longer content to mourn. He would not kneel. He would not wait for the Valar to act. He would challenge the greatest of all the Anor with steel, flame, and will. And so he made his choice, one that would change the fate of the Elves and Middle-earth forever. He would leave a man. He would return to Middle-earth, and he would take the Silmarils back by force. But this would not be a quiet departure. This would be a flight, a rebellion, against the Valar themselves. Fëanor stood before the Noldor and delivered a speech that burned like wildfire. He blamed the Valar for their inaction, for hiding the Elves in blissful captivity, while Morgoth walked free. He urged his people to reject servitude and reclaim their destiny. His words ignited hearts, especially among the younger generations, hungry for glory, purpose, and vengeance. Fëanor promised them freedom, a return to the lands beneath the stars, kingdoms of their own, the recovery of the Silmarils, the greatest treasures the Elves had ever known. Many were swept up in the fervor, and though some hesitated, questioning his motives or fearing the Valar's wrath, few could deny the raw power of his call to arms. Most critically, Fëanor and his 7 sons took the oath, the unbreakable vow that bound them to pursue the Silmarils at any cost, against any foe. The oath of Fëanor did not merely demand justice, it demanded blood. If any, even friend or kin, held a Silmaril, they would be enemies. The weight of those words would haunt the Elves for centuries. Yet not all were swayed by ambition. Fëanor, Fand, the wise and measured son of Finwë, looked upon the path ahead and turned back, leading his people to remain in Aman. But Fingolfin, the noble and just half-brother of Fëanor, chose to follow, not because he trusted Fëanor, far from it, but because he would not abandon his people to face danger alone. His choice was one of duty, not pride. The Noldor set out from Túrin, abandoning the beauty of Valinor and crossing into the dark north of Aman. Their march was grim and purposeful, the stars above their only light, and as they neared the coasts, their rebellion brought them to a terrible crossroads. To reach Middle-earth, they needed ships, but the only fleet capable of crossing the vast sea belonged to the Teleri, the sea-loving elves of Alqualondë. These were their kin, peaceful, gentle, and loyal to the Valar. When the Noldor arrived and demanded the ships, the Teleri refused. They would not lend their vessels to a war of pride and vengeance. They would not defy the Valar. Fëanor would not accept this answer. He ordered his followers to seize the ships by force. the Teleri resisted, and so the first kinslaying began. A tragedy unlike any the elves had ever known. Swords clashed under moonlight, white ships burned. The swan-feathered sails of Alqualande were torn and bloodied. Elf slew elf in a storm of confusion and terror. The Noldor, more experienced in war, ultimately overpowered the Teleri. The harbor fell. Many of the Teleri perished. Their beautiful ships were taken, not as gifts, but as spoils of war. The sea was stained red. The elves, once unblemished by violence among their own kind, had crossed a line that could never be undone. The Valar wept. The Teleri cursed the names of Fëanor and his son. And in the quiet aftermath, a heavy silence fell upon the host of the Noldor. Even among the Noldor, hearts began to waver. Those who had followed in hope now looked in horror at what they had become. Yet Fëanor pushed forward. He had set fire to the path behind him, and now there was no turning back. But the Valar had not remained silent. As the Noldor prepared to depart with the stolen ships, Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar, appeared before them. He spoke a prophecy that would become known as the Doom of the Noldor, a warning that their path would lead only to sorrow, betrayal and ruin, that they would be cursed by their oath, and that few of them would ever return. Fëanor rejected the warning. He declared he would rather be master of his own fate than live forever in the guarded bliss of Valinor. His words stirred many once more, but others, troubled by the doom, turned back. Fingolfin, grieving the bloodshed and fearing the prophecy, took his people home and was later welcomed by the Valar with honor. Fëanor, however, pressed on. The Noldor now faced the final crossing, the vast sea that separated a man from Middle-earth. But Fëanor, ever impatient, took the ships by night and abandoned Fingolfin and his followers on the shore. He sailed east with his sons and those loyal to him, and upon landing in Middle-earth, at the Firth of Drengist, he burned the ships at Loskar, ensuring that none could follow. Fingolfin and his host, watching the flames across the sea, knew they had been betrayed, but they did not yield. In an act of immense courage, they crossed the Hellarkarak, the grinding ice, a deadly frozen wasteland of jagged ice floes, bitter winds and constant peril. Many perished. But after long suffering, Fingolfin and his people reached Middle-earth, hardened by endurance and unbroken in spirit. Meanwhile, Fëanor wasted no time. He launched an assault on Morgoth's forces almost immediately after landing. At the battle under the stars, the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Noldor achieved a mighty victory. Orcs were slaughtered in droves, but Fëanor, in his relentless drive to reach Angband, pressed too far. He was ambushed by Balrogs, the fiery demons of Morgoth, and mortally wounded. Even in death, Fëanor's pride did not falter. As his sons carried him away, he gazed toward Morgoth's fortress and knew the truth. The Silmarils could not be reclaimed by force, yet his rage would not permit peace. He ordered his sons to uphold the oath, to never rest until the Silmarils were recovered. His spirit then departed his body with such fiery intensity that it consumed his flesh, and he vanished as flame, leaving only ash on the wind. And so the flight of the Noldor ended not with triumph, but with treachery, exile and death. The elves had cast aside paradise. They had shed the blood of their own kind, and in doing so they had set the foundations for an age of unending war, of kingdoms rising and falling, of heroes and betrayals, of sorrow that would echo across the ages of the world. The kinslaying was not forgotten, nor was the doom of man. The path had been chosen, and no one, not even the wisest or strongest, would walk it without paying a price. When the Noldor returned to Middle-earth, it was not to celebration or welcome, but to a land already darkened by the long reach of Morgoth. Gone were the days when the elves had awoken beside the starlit waters of Quivianen. In peace, the world they had once glimpsed in youthful wonder had become a battlefield, scarred by fire, shadow, and the grim remnants of the Dark Lord's ancient dominion. Fëanor was the first to land upon the shores, having crossed the sea with the stolen ships of the Teleri. He arrived in the cold northern coastlines of Lammoth, near the Firth of Drengist, a desolate region, echoing with the roar of waves and the cries of seabirds. There was no time for rest. Fëanor's rage had not dimmed, and his purpose was singular: to march straight for Angband, Morgoth's fortress in the north, and reclaim the Silmarils at the point of his sword. At this time, Morgoth was caught off guard. He had not expected the Noldor to arrive so soon or with such fury. His attention had been turned elsewhere, and the western coasts of Beleriand were poorly defended. Fëanor seized this moment. In what became known as the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the battle under the stars, Fëanor led the Noldor in a surprise assault against the advancing orc hosts of Morgoth. It was a slaughter. The Noldor, empowered by vengeance and still shining with the fire of Valinor, tore through Morgoth's legions with terrible precision. The orcs, though vast in number, were unprepared for the wrath of the returned exile. They were driven back in disarray, their numbers broken and their commanders slain. Among them was Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs, who would later become infamous, but he did not yet enter this battle. The stars watched silently as Fëanor and his sons carved a bloody path through the northwest of Beleriand. In the confusion, Morgoth sent fresh forces to confront them, but Fëanor, driven by obsession, pushed beyond caution. He believed the time had come for final vengeance. He pursued the retreating orcs all the way to the gates of Angband, where the iron crown of Morgoth glinted in the dark smoke of his mountain fortress. But Morgoth was not finished. From the depths of Angband, he unleashed the Balrogs, spirits of fire and terror, mire corrupted long ago, cloaked in flame and wielding whips of molten shadow. They descended upon Fëanor's small vanguard, and though he fought with unmatched fury, the High Prince of the Noldor was struck down. Mortally wounded, Fëanor was carried from the field by his sons. As he lay dying, his gaze still burned with hatred for Morgoth, and he uttered a grim prophecy that the Silmarils would never be recovered by his pride unbroken even in death. Fëanor's spirit burned so fiercely that his body was consumed in flame, leaving no tomb, no ashes, only legend. With his death, the leadership of the Noldor passed to his eldest son, Maedhros, a figure of great strength and honor. The remaining Noldor, now leaderless and weary from battle, halted their advance. They established a temporary camp in the north, mourning their father, reckoning with their losses, and awaiting the arrival of the rest of their people, for Fëanor had burned the ships, leaving Fingolfin and his host stranded. Meanwhile, Fingolfin and his people made the near-impossible crossing of the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice. The journey was long and cruel. They faced freezing winds, shifting glaciers and deadly chasms. Many perished, including Fingolfin's wife, but the Noldor did not turn back. Their march became one of the great testaments of endurance and courage in the First Age. At last, as the sun rose for the first time in the world, for the sun and moon had been created by the Valar using the last fruit of Lorelin and the final flower of Telperion, Fingolfin and his host arrived in Middle-earth. They landed with the first dawn, banners raised beneath golden light, a moment so powerful that the servants of Morgoth trembled. It is said that when Morgoth, hidden deep in Angband, heard of Fingolfin's coming, he was afraid. The Noldor now occupied the lands of northern Beleriand, pushing Morgoth back into his fortress. With Fëanor gone and Fingolfin now High King, the Elves began establishing realms and strongholds across the land. Maedhros, seeking to restore honor after his father's rashness, offered to meet Morgoth under truce, to negotiate the return of the Silmarils. But Morgoth, ever deceitful, betrayed him. The parley was a trap. Maedhros was ambushed, captured, and bound by the wrist to a sheer cliff of Thangorodrim, the volcanic peaks above Angband. For days Maedhros suffered in agony, yet it was Fëanor, the son of Fingolfin, who dared to rescue him. Defying Morgoth's gaze, Fëanor rode alone to Thangorodrim, and climbed the black cliffs in secret. He could not reach his friend until Manwë, moved by pity, sent his great eagle Thorondor to bear Fëanor along. Finding Maedhros bound and unable to free him, Fëanor was forced to cut off his hand at the wrist to release him. Maedhros was maimed, but his spirit was unbroken. In gratitude, and recognizing the nobility of Fingolfin's house, Maedhros renounced his claim to the high kingship of the Noldor, and Fingolfin was crowned king. This act healed much of the division caused by Fëanor's pride and began a time of unity among the Elves. The Noldor now began to build. They mapped Beleriand, forged alliances with the Sindar, the Grey Elves who had remained in Middle-earth, and established strongholds, Gondolin in the secret vale of Tumliden, Nargothrond beside the river Narog, Himring, Hithlum, Doriath, and Aethel Sirion. Their cities rose in stone and song, and their blades were forged anew. The age of exile had become an age of defiance, yet Morgoth did not rest. Deep within Angband, he summoned darker things, wolves with burning eyes, dragons sleeping in molten pits, and shadows not seen since the world's forming. He wore the Silmarils in his crown, though their pure light seared his flesh, but he would not remove them. They were his prize, and the doom of those who sought them. Thus began the long siege of Angband, a time when the Noldor ringed the fortress of Morgoth, holding back his armies and striving to keep the darkness at bay. For nearly 4 centuries, the siege held. Peace, though uneasy, reigned in much of Beleriand. But this peace was merely a pause, a breath before the storm. The fires of war still burned beneath the earth, and Morgoth, patient and cunning, waited for the right moment to strike. The return of the Noldor had been swift, glorious and terrible. They had drawn their swords, spilled the blood of kin, defied the gods, and challenged the Dark Lord. They had claimed a foothold in a land once forsaken, but the cost had only just begun to unfold. In the early years after the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, the war against Morgoth stood at a stalemate. The Dark Lord had retreated deep into Angband, his fortress beneath the 3 volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim, and though his forces still stirred in the shadows, the elves now held dominion across much of Beleriand. Strongholds rose from river valleys to mountain passes, banners of starlit silver and gold flew above the hills, and for the first time since the light of the trees was lost, the Noldor had begun to shape a new world. At the head of this rising strength stood Fingolfin, the second son of Finwë and now High King of the Noldor. His reign was marked by unity, for he had overcome the bitter legacy of Fëanor's betrayal, and forged peace between the once divided houses of the elves. Even Medros, eldest of Fëanor's sons, had bowed to Fingolfin's kingship, after being rescued from the torment of Thangorodrim. Together, they established a vast perimeter of watch and resistance that came to be known as the Siege of Angband. The siege itself was a marvel of elven determination and military strength. From the fortress of Himring in the northeast to battered Evel near the source of the river Sirion, the Noldor built towers, outposts, and citadel. Fingolfin's own realm was established in Hithlum, behind the mountains of Eredwethrin, where his people defended the westward approaches to Angband. The sons of Fëanor held the lands further east, Medros, Maglor, Caranthir, and the others dividing the hills and rivers between them. To the south, Turgon, Fingolfin's son, had disappeared into secret labor, later revealed to be the building of Gondolin, hidden deep within the encircling mountain. And Finrod Felagund, son of Fingolfin, constructed the beautiful underground realm of Nargothrond, Thrond, aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountain. These alliances with the dwarves, rare though they were, proved fruitful, for the dwarves brought iron and skill to the Noldor, helping to craft arms and fortifications that even Morgoth came to fear. For nearly 400 years the long peace held. During this time, the elves prospered. They hunted, sang, and studied the stars. They married, bore children, and established lore that would echo through the ages. It was a time of hope, of fragile, flickering hope beneath the shadow of Angband. Even the Sindar, long wary of the returning Noldor, found common cause in resisting Morgoth's evils. But beneath the peace, a storm brewed. Morgoth had not been idle. From the depths of Angband, he devised new horrors. The siege had not truly crippled him. It had only delayed his design. His spies slithered through the cracks of the world, and foul creatures moved in secret paths beneath the mountains. Most dangerous of all was his new creation, Glorung, the father of dragons, who first appeared as a young but devastating force in the 260th year of the First Age. Still immature, Glorung emerged from Angband, and laid waste to parts of Ardgalen, the wide plain before the gates of Morgoth. But when faced with a swift counterattack by Fingon, son of Fingolfin, the dragon retreated. Morgoth had revealed his hand too soon, and Glorung's withdrawal delayed his next great assault. Yet it was a warning, a sign of what was to come. Fingolfin understood this more than any. Though wise and just, he bore the weight of kingship with a warrior's heart. The peace he had overseen was valuable, but he knew it was only temporary. The true war, the real reckoning with Morgoth, still lay ahead, and in his deepest moments of reflection, he feared that the doom of the Noldor, spoken by Mandos, still hung above them like a thundercloud. Then came the breaking of the siege. In the winter of the 455th year of the First Age, Morgoth unleashed his fury in the battle known as the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Rivers of fire erupted from beneath the earth as Angband spewed forth fire and ash, consuming the green plains of Ardgalen and transforming it into a blackened, smoking wasteland thenceforth called Anfoglith, the gasping dust. Legions of orcs poured out from hidden gates, led by Balrogs and Dragonfire. Glorung now returned in his full might, spewing flame across the battle lines. The siege was shattered in a single night. Great fortresses were overrun, and the northern defenses of the Noldor crumbled. Even the might of Dorthonion, held by the house of Beor, could not withstand the assault. Brave mortal lords like Barahir fought to the end, but their people were driven into hiding. The Noldor had been caught unprepared. For all their vigilance, they had not believed Morgoth capable of breaking forth with such fury, and when the smoke cleared, much of their hard-won realm had been consumed in flame. It was in the wake of this devastation that Fingolfin made his fateful decision. Racked with grief and fury, believing that the war was now lost and that his people faced annihilation, the High King of the Noldor did something no elf had dared before. He rode alone to the gates of Angband. Across the scorched plains of Anfoglith he galloped, bearing his sword Ringil, clad in silver and blue, his banner streaming behind him. No orc dared challenge him, for they feared the terrible light in his eye. He came before the black gates and called Morgoth forth, challenging the Dark Lord to single combat. Morgoth hesitated, for though he was the mightiest of the Aenir who entered Arda, he feared Fingolfin, feared his valor, his wrath, and the authority of his kingship. Yet pride demanded that he answer, and so for the only time in the entire history of Middle-earth, Morgoth left his throne to fight in single combat. The duel that followed became legend. Fingolfin stood alone before the greatest enemy the world had ever known. Morgoth came in black armor, towering and vast, wielding Grond, the hammer of the underworld. Each blow he struck carved craters into the earth, splitting stone and shaking the mountains. But Fingolfin danced between them, swift and terrible, and his blade Ringil shone like ice. He wounded Morgoth 7 times, and the cries of the Dark Lord echoed to the ends of the world. But in the end, Fingolfin stumbled. His shield was broken, his strength failing. Morgoth crushed him beneath his foot, but even then, with his last breath, Fingolfin drove his sword into Morgoth's foot, forever maiming him. The High King fell, yet his defiance lit the hearts of his people for generations. Morgoth would never forget the pain of that duel, nor would he ever again emerge from Angband to fight in person. The wound Fingolfin gave him was both physical and spiritual, a permanent reminder that even the brightest fire in the world could burn him. After the duel, Morgoth ordered the Elven king's body to be fed to wolves, but Thorondor, Lord of Eagles, swooped down, scarred Morgoth's face with his talons, and bore Fingolfin's body away, delivering it to a high peak in the Acoriath, where he was laid to rest in honor by Túrin. Thus ended the long peace, with fire, with ruin, and with the fall of the noblest king of the Noldor. But his death was not in vain. His courage rekindled hope, even as the shadows grew deep. And though Morgoth had broken the siege, he had not yet broken the spirit of the free peoples of Beleriand. The war was not over. The age of heroes had only just begun. For nearly 4 centuries after the Noldor returned to Middle-earth, a delicate stalemate held between the forces of Morgoth and the Elves of Beleriand. This fragile balance, forged by strength, strategy, and vigilance, became known as the Siege of Angband, and it allowed the Noldor to spread across the land, building kingdoms and crafting wonders amid the starlight. But Morgoth was never idle. Deep within the iron depths of Angband, the Dark Lord forged weapons not merely of steel and flame, but of malice, strategy, and domination. He watched the elves from afar, learning their weaknesses, testing their defenses, and preparing a storm not even the mightiest of them could endure. That storm would come in the 455th year of the First Age, in a firestorm that would rend the land and break the power of the Noldor. The Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, did not begin with swords. It began with the earth itself screaming. Without warning, the volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim roared to life, and torrents of fire erupted from Angband's hidden furnaces. Rivers of flame carved across the plains of Ardgalen, incinerating everything in their path. The green fields that had long served as the front line of the Noldoran siege were consumed in an instant. Smoke and ash blackened the sky, and the land was renamed Anfoglith, the gasping dust, a name it would never lose. Under cover of this inferno, Morgoth unleashed his legions. Orcs poured out of Angband in numbers not seen since the First War. With them came fire-breathing drakes, and at their head, Gloreng, the father of dragons, now fully grown and armored in scales thick as plate. Balrogs led shock assaults, their whips of flame cracking across the battlefield. This was not a raid, it was annihilation. The Noldor were taken utterly by surprise. Their watchfires were swept away by firestorms, and their northern forts were buried under the wrath of the mountain. In the east, Maglor's Gap, once a narrow but vital pass between strongholds, became a bleeding wound through which Morgoth's armies poured. The bastion of Dorthonion, held by the lords of the House of Beor, was assailed relentlessly. It fell into shadow, its green hills turned to dark and haunted wastes. Angrod and Aegnor, sons of Fingolfin, were slain defending Dorthonion. The lands were overrun, and the mortal houses of men who had sworn allegiance to the Noldor were scattered or hunted. But in the midst of ruin, heroes rose. Berhir, a chieftain of the House of Beor, and father of Beren, fought with unmatched valor. He rallied the last defenders in the highlands of Dorthonion, and held out against the tide. For his deeds, Fëanor, now High King of the Noldor, after his father Fingolfin's death, gave Berhir the Ring of Filagund, a token of eternal friendship. That ring, passed down through generations, would one day reach Aragorn, King of Gondor. Yet no valor could stem the tide. One by one, the strongholds fell. Maedhros and his brothers, who had held the eastern marches for centuries, found their defenses collapsing. Caranthir's lands were overwhelmed, and he was forced to retreat to the south. Maglor lost his fortress entirely, and Maedhros was driven back to the hill of Himring, a lonely outpost that stood defiant amid ruin. There he made his stand, and through sheer resolve, he held the hill against countless assaults. It was the last bastion in the east. In the shadowed wake of the Dagor Bragollach, as kingdoms fell and hope withered in the north of Beleriand, a darker tale began to unfold. Not a tale of glory or victory, but of doom. A single name would come to embody the sorrow, wrath, and shattered heroism of the First Age: Túrin Turambar, the son of Hurin Thelion, and perhaps the most tragic figure in all the histories of elves and men. Túrin's story begins with his father, Hurin, Lord of Dor Lomin, a mighty warrior of the House of Hador, and one of the greatest mortal allies the elves had ever known. During the fateful Nugrineth Arnediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, Hurin and his brother Huir stood alongside Fingon, High King of the Noldor, in a last-ditch attempt to break the power of Morgoth. They fought valiantly, but Morgoth's treachery, aided by Ulfeng the Black and his Easterling kin, shattered the alliance. In the final hours of the battle, as the elves fell and Fingon was slain, Hurin and a small company made their last stand at the Fen of Serech, holding back the tide so that Turgon and the remnants of Gondolin could escape. For a full day, Hurin slew countless foes until he stood alone, surrounded by corpses. He was finally captured and brought before Morgoth himself. There, in the dark halls of Angband, Morgoth demanded to know the hidden location of Gondolin. Hurin, proud and unyielding, refused. In his fury, Morgoth cursed not only Hurin, but his entire family line, especially his unborn son. He chained Hurin to a seat on the peaks of Thangorodrim and forced him to watch, helpless, as the curse unfolded. And so the life of Túrin, son of Hurin and Morwen, began, already shadowed by doom. After Hurin's capture, Morgoth's forces overran Dor Lomin, and Morwen, proud and defiant, feared for her son's life. She sent young Túrin away to the hidden elven kingdom of Doriath, hoping he would be safe under the protection of Thingol and Melian. There, in the halls of Menegroth, Túrin was raised like a prince, honored as a son of a hero, and kin to Elves. Thingol loved him, and Melian, with her Maya wisdom, sensed both greatness and danger in him. Túrin grew tall and mighty, clad in black and bearing the look of a lord before he reached manhood. He became a peerless warrior, fearless and bold. But even in the peace of Doriath, Morgoth's curse followed him. In time, Túrin accidentally caused the death of an elf named Saros, who had insulted him. Though the act was not murder, Túrin fled Doriath before he could face justice. Unwilling to submit to judgment, too proud to explain, Thingol tried to recall him, but Túrin was gone, and his path would grow ever darker from that moment on. He became a wanderer, known by many names. First, he led a band of outlaws in the woods, becoming a grim and feared captain. Later, he found refuge in the forest of Brethil, where he fought alongside the Haladin, defending them from orcs. But his most fateful chapter began in Nargothrond, the underground kingdom, ruled by Orodreth, descendant of Finrod Felagund. There, Túrin assumed a false name, Agarwin the Blood-Stained, but soon his deeds brought him renown. He advised Orodreth to abandon secrecy and build a great bridge over the river Narog, urging open war against Morgoth. Under his command, Nargothrond forged new weapons, and Túrin became the champion of the realm, bearing the cursed black sword Gurthang, reforged from Anglakel, the blade once wielded by Belicothalli. Gurthang, forged of meteor iron and steeped in strange darkness, seemed to have a will of its own. Though it served Túrin loyally, it gleamed with a pale fire, and its blade would ultimately know the blood of both friend and kin. Túrin's warlike counsel brought short-term victories, but Morgoth took notice. In retaliation, he unleashed Glurung, the father of dragons. The beast, now full-grown and cunning, descended upon Nargothrond. The city fell swiftly. The mighty bridge Túrin had built allowed Glurung to enter with ease. Túrin fought the dragon, but was paralyzed by its gaze. As Glurung stared into his eyes, the weight of Morgoth's curse poured into his soul. The dragon twisted his mind, convincing him that his mother and sister were suffering far to the east. In anguish, Túrin abandoned the ruins of Nargothrond and chased this phantom hope. But it was a lie. His mother Morwen and his sister Nienor were not there, at least, not yet. After the fall of Nargothrond, Morwen and Nienor journeyed to find him, refusing to remain in hiding. But they were attacked near the ruins by Glurung. Nienor, looking into the dragon's eyes, was struck with complete amnesia. Lost, terrified, and stripped of memory, she wandered the woods, until she was found by Túrin. Neither knew who the other was. Túrin, broken and guilt-ridden, offered her protection. He named her Niel, Termaid, and she, drawn to his sorrow and strength, came to love him. In time, they were wed. The curse had reached its apex. Unknowingly, Túrin had married his sister. They lived for a time in peace among the people of Brethil, defending the forest against orcs and beasts. Túrin became their champion once more, a war leader cloaked in black, feared by all foes. But Glurung returned. The dragon descended upon Brethil, seeking to complete his work. Túrin met him alone in battle. Using stealth and cunning, he slew the beast with a stroke of Gurthang, stabbing up through its belly. Yet as Glurung died, his final breath lifted the enchantment upon Nienor. Her memories returned. Horrified at the truth that she had loved and lain with her own brother, Nienor threw herself from a cliff and perished. Túrin, upon learning the truth, was devastated beyond comprehension. All the shame, rage and sorrow of his cursed life broke him. He returned to the site where Glurung lay dead, spoke his final words, and fell upon Gurthang, which took his life. Even the sword, it is said, cracked beneath the weight of his death. His grave was raised by the Haladin, carved with the words, Túrin Turambar Dagnir, Glurunga, Túrin Turambar, slayer of Glurung, and beneath that, later carved by his mother and sister, Nienor Nienlael, though no body lay there beside him. Thus ended the life of Túrin, a man of great valor, monstrous tragedy, and cursed fate. He was a mortal who dared to defy Morgoth, not with armies or kingdoms, but with his will, again and again, no matter how often he was broken. In the end, his doom was not simply Morgoth's curse. It was also his own pride, his own choices, and his refusal to bend to a world filled with sorrow. Yet the elves remembered him not only for his fall, but for his strength. In the last battle, it is said Túrin will return and strike the final blow against Morgoth, with Gurthang reforged, bringing the tale of the cursed child of men to a final, redemptive close. Among all the tales of sorrow and glory, In the first age of Middle-earth, none shine brighter or reach deeper into the hearts of elves and men than the story of Beren and Lúthien. It is a tale of impossible love, of courage that defied the greatest darkness, and of two souls, one mortal, one immortal, who dared to challenge the will of Morgoth himself. In all of Tolkien's legendarium, theirs is the tale closest to the author's heart, for it was inspired by his own love for his wife, Edith, and etched onto their shared gravestone as a living echo of this legend. The story begins in the wake of catastrophe. After the Dagor Bragollach, Morgoth's forces poured across Beleriand, shattering the great strongholds of the Noldor and laying waste to the lands of the free peoples. The once beautiful highlands of Dorthunen, home to the House of Beor, were scorched and twisted into Tar Nu Fúin, a forest of dread and darkness. Only a few remnants of resistance remained, scattered men and women who refused to yield. Among them was Barahir, lord of the House of Beor, who fought on in secret with a dwindling band of followers. Barahir's defiance was short-lived. He was betrayed by one of his own and slain, but his son Beren survived. Alone in the wilderness of Tar Nu Fúin, Beren became a ghost among the trees, a hunter of orcs and a nightmare whispered among Morgoth's servants. For 4 years he lived as an outlaw, clad in rags and shadow, avenging his father and earning the name Beren Shamian, Beren one-handed. But even the greatest of warriors cannot survive forever alone. Eventually he was driven from the forest and made his way south, into the guarded land of Doriath, the hidden forest realm of Thingol and Melian. It was there that fate turned. In the glades of Neldoreth, beneath the starlight and the rustling trees, Beren first saw Lúthien Tenuviel dancing, and the world changed. Lúthien was no ordinary elf. She was the daughter of Thingol, king of Doriath, and Melian the Maya, a being of divine origin. Through her flowed the light of the two trees, the grace of the Valar, and the wisdom of ages. She was the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar, her hair dark as the shadows of twilight, her eyes like starlight. And Beren, mortal and weary, loved her instant. To Lúthien, too, something stirred. Where other mortals would have feared or fled the mighty girdle of Melian that guarded Doriath, Beren passed through it unknowing, his heart true. And in that moment, love bloomed, a love so pure that it would shake kingdoms and stir the heart of the Dark Lord. But when Beren came before Thingol and asked for Lúthien's hand, the king's pride flared. He looked upon Beren, a ragged mortal, and laughed. Yet Melian, who saw more than any, warned her husband to beware. What he set in motion could not be undone. Thingol, in arrogance, declared that Beren could only wed Lúthien if he achieved an impossible task: to retrieve one of the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. It was a death sentence, but Beren did not falter. He accepted the quest, not for pride, but for love. And thus began one of the most daring adventures in all of Arda. Beren set out alone, intending to infiltrate Angband, the unassailable fortress of the Black Enemy. Along the way he was captured by orcs, but escaped with the help of Finrod Filigund, the elven king of Nargothrond, who had sworn an oath of friendship to Beren's father. Finrod in a company of elves accompanied Beren north, disguising themselves as orcs. But Morgoth's forces were cunning. They were captured by Sauron, Morgoth's lieutenant, who stripped away their disguises and imprisoned them in the dungeons of Tol and Garhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. One by one, Finrod's companions were devoured by beasts. At last, Finrod himself sacrificed his life to save Beren, slaying a wolf with his bare hands, but dying from his wounds. Beren was left alone in the darkness, but Lúthien had not waited in Doriath. Defying her father, she fled and made her way north, aided by the great hound Huan, a gift of the Valar to the house of Celegorm, one of Fëanor's sons. Huan, though bound to Celegorm, turned against his master and helped Lúthien escape captivity. Disguised in shadow, Lúthien came to the Isle of Werewolves. There, with her voice alone, she broke the spell of darkness. She sang the tower into silence, defeated Sauron with her power, and rescued Beren from torment. Sauron fled and his tower collapsed into ruin. Beren, once more free, begged her to return to safety, but she would not leave his side. Together, they pressed on, to Angband itself. No mortal or elf had ever entered Angband and returned. But Lúthien, cloaked in a magical disguise woven from her own enchanted hair and spells of sleep, walked directly into the heart of Morgoth's realm. She sang before his throne, and even the black enemy was entranced. For the first and only time, Morgoth was put into a trap. Beren seized the moment. Drawing a knife, he cut a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. But as he attempted to take another, the blade snapped, and a shard flew into Morgoth's face. The spell was broken. They fled, but not far. At the gates of Angband, they were set upon by Karsharoth, the great wolf Morgoth had bred to guard his realm. Beren, in desperation, held the Silmaril aloft, but the wolf bit off his hand, swallowing the jewel. The power of the Silmaril burned the beast from within, and it fled in madness. Beren, gravely wounded, was carried away by Beren and Lúthien. At last they returned to Doriath. Beren, near death, laid before Thingol and presented his missing hand, declaring that the Silmaril was within, and that the quest had been fulfilled. Thingol, moved beyond words, relented. Lúthien and Beren were wed, but their joy was brief. The Silmaril within Karsharoth tormented the wolf, who ravaged the forests of Doriath, in madness. A great hunt was called, and Beren joined it. In the final battle, he and Beren slew the beast, but Beren was mortally wounded. Lúthien wept over his body, and in her sorrow did what no other had done. She passed into the halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the dead dwell, and sang before the doomsman of the Valar. Her song was so beautiful, so filled with grief and love, that even Mandos was moved. And so a choice was given. Lúthien could return to Valinor alone, to dwell among the immortals, or she could return to life with Beren, as a mortal herself doomed to die. She chose love. Together, Beren and Lúthien returned to life and dwelt in peace for a time in Osiriand, far from war and shadow. There they lived, and there they died, the first mortal and immortal to be joined beyond the laws of the world. Their Silmaril would pass into the line of Elros and Elrond, into the blood of kings and heirs, and eventually to Eärendil, who would sail the skies with its light. But their tale of love that defied gods and darkness would be remembered above all others. Even Morgoth, in all his power, could not silence love. Even death, in all its finality, could not end it. And in their union, a new hope was born, one that would endure even into the age of the first age of Middle-earth, born in the light of the two trees and marred by the rebellion of Fëanor, had been a time of grandeur and ruin, of mighty kingdoms and deep sorrows. Across centuries of war and wonder, elves and men had battled the darkness of Morgoth. They had seen cities fall, heroes die, and the very land reshaped by fire and grief. Yet through it all, the black enemy had endured, wounded by defiance, but never overthrown. By the end of the age, Morgoth ruled from the iron pits of Angband, his crown still bearing the Silmarils. Most of Beleriand lay under shadow or ruin. Doriath, the once golden realm of Thingol and Melian, was no more, destroyed by the sons of Fëanor in their doomed pursuit of the Silmarils. Nargothrond had fallen to Glorua. Gondolin, the hidden city of Turgon, had been betrayed and razed by fire and steel. The elves were scattered. The kingdoms of men were broken. And yet a single Silmaril, rescued from Morgoth's grasp by Beren and Lúthien, passed down through their bloodline, now shone with hope in the hands of their son, Éireann, born of a mortal father and an elven mother, Tuar and Idril of Gondolin. Eärendil carried within him both the light of Eman and the resilience of men. He was a mariner, a wanderer, and a dreamer. With the Silmaril on his brow, he sailed the shadowed seas in his ship Fingolfin, seeking a path to the blessed realm, not for glory, but for salvation. For the cries of Middle-earth had grown too great. The free peoples could no longer stand alone. Morgoth could not be defeated by sword or courage alone. The time had come for the Valar, the powers of the West, to return, and Eärendil found the way. Guided by the light of the Silmaril, he passed beyond the enchanted isles, through the shadowy seas, and reached the shores of Im. No mortal had done so before. There he stood before the Valar and pleaded not for himself, but for elves and men, for the ruined world, for mercy. He begged them to rise once more, to bring war upon the Dark Lord, and to save the dying land. The Valar listened. At last, after centuries of silence, they answered. The Valar convened a great council. Manwë, High King of Arda, declared that Morgoth's crimes would be answered. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, had long been the only Valar still moving among the peoples of Middle-earth. But now all would act. Tulkas, the warrior, readied his wrath. Eärendil, the herald of Manwë and the mightiest of the Maiar, was chosen to lead the host. Thus began the final conflict of the First Age, the War of Wrath. It was a war unlike any seen before or since. The Valar sent forth a vast host, the host of the West, composed of Vanyar elves, Maiar spirits, and the captains of Valinor. They crossed the sea in silence, and came ashore at the mouths of Sirion, where remnants of the elves still held out. When they came, the very earth trembled. The sea whispered with songs not sung since the making of the world. Hope, long lost, stirred again. At their head, Ironwë bore a standard of light, and the armies of the west marched north. Morgoth, unprepared for such might, was filled with dread. For all his cunning, he had not expected the Valar to rise in force. He unleashed all his remaining strength. The skies were blackened with winged beasts, dragons born of fire and shadow. Balrogs, few in number but terrible in power, rose from their hiding. Orcs poured from every gate of Angband. The world shook. The battle raged across Anfoglith, the ruined plain before Thangorodrim. Mountains shattered, rivers boiled, lightning split the sky. The dragons of Morgoth, led by Ancalagon the Black, the largest and most terrifying of them all, descended in fury. The Valar's host faltered, until Eärendil himself returned. From the sky he came in Vindalit, now a ship of the heavens, sailing through the stars. Upon his brow still burned the Silmaril, and with him flew the great eagles of Manwë. In a battle above the clouds, Eärendil fought Ancalagon. For a full day and night they clashed in the air, until at last, Ancalagon was slain and cast down upon Thangorodrim, breaking the towers of Morgoth's fortress. With the death of Ancalagon, the tide turned. Angband was broken, its gates torn open. The dungeons were emptied, and the fires of its forges were quenched. Morgoth, the first and greatest of the Dark Lords, was captured at last. His crown was beaten into a collar, and he was bound in chains. The Silmarils were taken from him, and he was cast out of the world, thrust through the door of night, beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless void. But the victory came at great cost. The violence of the war was so immense that the very shape of the world was altered. Much of Beleriand, the land that had been the heart of the First Age, was sunk beneath the sea. Only fragments remained. Lindon, the western shore where the elves would gather, Himring, still standing as a lonely hill, and small parts of Assyriand and Dorthonian's southern edges. With the war ended, the Valar offered a choice to the half-elven, the children of mortal and immortal unions. Eärendil and Elwing, his wife, were the first to choose. Eärendil chose the fate of elves, and was placed in the sky as a star, guiding light to all mariners. Elwing joined him. Their children, Elrond and Elros, were given the same choice. Elros chose to be counted among men, and became the first king of Númenor. Elrond chose to be of elven kind, and would go on to become Lord of Rivendell. As for the Silmarils, their fate was not yet fully written. The sons of Fëanor, bound by their terrible oath, sought to reclaim the Silmarils even from the Valar. Only two remained, one taken by Eärendil, the other by Elwing before she fled into the sea. In a final desperate act, Mandaros and Maglor, the last surviving sons of Fëanor, stole them. But the Silmarils rejected them, for the Silmarils could not be held by those who were impure, and the crimes of the oath had made Mandaros and Maglor unworthy. The Silmaril in Mandaros' hand burned him so severely that in agony and despair, he cast himself into a fiery chasm, ending his life and the line of Fëanor. Maglor, too, was burned by the jewel, and cast it into the sea. He wandered the shores of the world in sorrow, singing laments that were never heard in full. Thus the three Silmarils, one in the sky with Eärendil, one in the earth's depths, and one in the sea, were forever lost to mortal hands. Their light remained, scattered across sky and sea and stone, unreachable yet eternal. So ended the First Age, not in triumph alone, but in fire and grief, in sorrow and silence. Kingdoms were drowned, bloodlines broken, songs silenced. And yet in that ending, a new beginning stirred. The Second Age dawned. Men of Númenor rose in greatness. The elves who remained turned their gaze eastward, and the shadow of Morgoth, though banished, left behind his most faithful servant, Sauron, who would rise anew. But in the ruins of Beleriand, beneath the waves, the voices of the past still echo. The courage of Fingolfin, the love of Beren and Lúthien, the doom of Túrin, the fire of Fëanor, all live on, for the First Age was not merely an age of war, it was the age of legend.